Well, welcome back to another one of our studies in Psalms. We have taken this a little out of order. Today, we're going to be looking at Psalm 100. In the United States, we're celebrating Thanksgiving this week. And I want to take a few minutes just to talk about that. But so you can see my background, I'm fading out for a moment. And you can see what a beautiful thing this is. Thanksgiving ties to the idea of harvest in a lot of other countries, but it's much more. And I'd like to take just a moment to explain the American Thanksgiving, a very brief description of it. When the what we call the Pilgrims, they were people who were suffering from religious persecution in England, and they saw their opportunity to form their own community by sailing over to the United. Well, it wasn't the United States then; it was the New World. It was what it was called. They landed in an area that's not the state of Massachusetts, in the northern part on the Atlantic coast of the United States. But they were ill prepared to really settle in the new land. The first year was particularly difficult. Their crops did not do well, and they went through the first winter, which was very severe, and many, over half of them died. Children died, the elderly died first, of course, and it was really quite bad. Well, nearby there was a tribe of Native Americans, and the Native Americans felt pity for them, and somehow one of them actually spoke English, which is kind of unusual, and he became sort of the liaison between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, and they showed them how to plant the proper crops and introduce them to maize, which we know is corn today, and a number of other things that flourished in that type of environment. And then they got to the harvest time. They had a big feast. They called it Thanksgiving, and they invited the Native Americans to join them. Now, there's a lot of mythology around that and so on, but that's essentially the story, and we celebrate that in the United States each year. It actually was not an annual celebration. It didn't happen again from a national standpoint until Abraham Lincoln was the president of the United States. And then it kind of faded again. And then about 75 years ago, it was made a national holiday every year. And so we celebrate it. For us, it like in Asia, they have the reunion meals. And that's kind of what they do. All the family tries to come together. And it is a time when people try to be thankful. If people don't have relatives nearby, they try to get with friends. The idea is to share the day with somebody. And although not all people are Christians, even sometimes in a non-Christian home, they'll have a prayer of thanksgiving. But certainly for Christians, it's a time of great thanksgiving. Well, this was one of these Psalms of ascent, and we'll come across that a number of times in our study. And the Psalms of ascent were used by those who were coming to Jerusalem for the three feast days. And as the thousands and thousands of pilgrims were coming to Jerusalem to celebrate, they would come over the Mount of Olives, and which goes into the Kidron Valley and then back up to the city of Jerusalem. And that as you come over the Mount of Olives, there is the city of Jerusalem. It's a magnificent sight. And in those days, of course, the first thing they would see is this gleaming temple that belonged to Jerusalem, especially Solomon's temple. And it was white and it had gold trim. And when the sun hit it, it was absolutely spectacular. And of course, their anticipation for these feast days and so on. And so as they came over the mountain and down the mountain and back up into Jerusalem, they would sing these psalms of ascent. And if you can imagine, they were sung what we call with an antiphonal kind of effect, where one side would sing one line, then it would be answered by the other side. So you had tens of thousands of people singing these songs back and forth and back and forth. And for example, we get into this one, and the second verse says, "Worship the Lord with gladness." One part would sing, "Worship the Lord with gladness." Then the others would answer from the other side, "Come before him with joyful songs." It was just an amazing thing to experience. And so when we look at this psalm, we are looking at an antiphonal type of music. It goes back to the ancient days, and it was a song of celebration. Unfortunately, we do not have the melody, and that's much to our loss. And I suppose one of the great things in heaven will be to hear the melodies that God's people through the ages for centuries and centuries sang as they approached Jerusalem. Well, let's look at this psalm. We're going to read it, and then we'll, again, just look at some of what we want to make remarks about. Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful songs. Know that the Lord is God. It is he who has made us, and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving, and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. For the Lord is good, and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations. Well, we look at Psalm 1. It says that we are to shout for joy to the Lord. Well, that's quite an interesting type of idea. It is like a fanfare, if you will, for the king. Excuse me. Allergy time here in our country. Anyway, and the idea is that they are saying that all the earth should join in this shout of praise to God. Now, this is where we get an idea that the Israelites occasionally had the sense, not always, unfortunately, that their religion was to be a witness to the world so that the world could receive salvation. Now, they a lot of times are so internally focused, they forgot about that, and they began to think of the Gentiles as being outside and being worthy of punishment, and for good reason, because the Gentile nations around them often wanted to destroy them. We can understand how they became resentful over that, but nonetheless, that the intention of God was for Israel to be a witness to the nations and to share the good news about him around the world. So in this psalm, you get the psalmist got an idea about this. A shout for joy, all the earth. It was to encompass everybody. And certainly we know in our early Salvation Army that there was an idea that salvation would reach to all the world, and the Salvation Army would be part of that witness. And we see that in some of our old songs and so on. And I hope that in some ways we still believe that salvation is for everybody. I hope in a very real way we do, that everybody can receive Christ. Now, whether everybody will, that's another question. But certainly we need to be a witness to the whole world. And we need to share with everybody the good news of Christ. Now, they have to make their own decisions, but we need to share this good news about him. Well, let me get back to this. It says, worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful songs. And again, he says, come before him. It's saying we are to draw near to him. We are to in a special way. Of course, God is everywhere, but we certainly know there is this within us, this turning of our hearts and minds toward the Lord, and the seeking him out and becoming aware of his presence. And that's what the psalmist is saying to us. We need to come before him, to be near him, to praise him, and to worship him. So we are, and the idea too is this coming is an action that we take, that we don't just sit there passively, that we decide we are going to make the initiative to seek God out. And then the next thing goes to our mind, know that the Lord is God, and what? It is he who has made us and not ourselves. That is that's amazing. Know that the Lord is God, is he who has made us, and we are his. It says we are his people, the sheep of his pasture. This idea that we belong to the Lord, that he has total ownership of us, that there is nothing we withhold. And like, again, we just finished talking about that in the 23rd Psalm about being the sheep of his pasture, that we follow him. We trust his leading. We know he's taking us to the places where we need to be. We know he's going to guard us from the dangers that we might face, that as his sheep, we follow him on as closely as we can. Now, again, we get this fourth verse, and we could see how the children of Israel, as they were coming up that Kidron Valley and into the walled city of Jerusalem, we hear them just at this point sing this: enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. And by that time, they were crowding in toward the temple, and they were singing this. And they said, and now we're here, give thanks to him, praise his name. Well, it is a marvelous thing that, it's something we probably have lost. But the idea in the ancient world was the names meant so very much. That's why so often it wasn't enough, for example, for the children of Israel to just drill a well. They had to give it a name. It wasn't enough for them to build an altar. They had to give it a name. The idea of naming was extremely, extremely important. The idea of how they named their children was very important. It was something that was given a lot of thought. And indeed, there was some feeling that if you knew, for example, the name of a demon, you could have power over it. And so the names had special meaning to them that perhaps doesn't carry as much forward into our modern world. And so when the psalmist says, praise his name, that there is a special emphasis upon upholding the name of the Lord. And we know that they treasured the name of God. For example, when the scribes wrote the name of God, we say Yahweh is kind of the best translation we have in our current world, but it may have been pronounced a little differently. But when they would write that, they would take the quill, the feather quill that they were writing with, and they would throw it away, because they didn't want to desecrate the name of God by ever using that quill again. That's how much they esteem the name of God. And indeed, in our Bible, where you have the capital letters Lord, was where the name of the Lord appeared, because we don't even dare really in normal ways say the name of God for fear that we will blaspheme it, or that we'll make it bring it down by our lips that are not sanctified. And so when they say, they're saying at this point that we want to praise his name, they're saying that now in our praise, we can say his name, because we are giving him the glory as best we can with what we have. And why? Well, the last verse says, for the Lord is good, and his love endures forever. Now, this was a terrible time when the children of Israel lived. I mean, certainly there were those who lived in palaces, and there were people who had power. But for the most part, most people scraped by in their existence. They were lucky to get through. Disease was everywhere. You had marauding bands of raiders. You had crime along the roads. You had invading armies. You had all sorts of injuries that if you were injured with anything serious, you just either died or you were sentenced to poverty the rest of your life. If a woman's husband died, she was in abject poverty, dependent upon her relatives for any kind of sustenance they would have. And if they were poor, she could very much be on her own. These were difficult days. But the psalmist says, the Lord is good. If you're going to try to define your blessing by material things, you're going to be a very sad person indeed, because they're never enough. They won't last. You can't take them with you. They're of only transitory value. We have to find our blessing in the goodness of God, and in knowing that his love is there for us, and that whatever circumstance we find ourselves in, wherever we are, his love is there with us. His love will always be there with us. And the good thing is, as the psalmist says, and his faithfulness continues to all generations. So for my children, for my grandchildren, I can say to them, the Lord is good, and he will be good for you. And when my grandchildren grow up and they have their own children, his goodness will be good for them. And if this world shall last 1,000 or 10,000 more years, God will be good in all those generations. God will show himself to be true. God will show himself to be loving. God will show himself to be saving. We serve a great God. And as we're at this Thanksgiving times, we ought to not just thank God for the things we have and the blessings of those who sit around the table, as great as that might be, but thank the Lord that in and of himself, he is good and he is faithful and he is loving. And that if we have received him in our hearts, he is ours. That's powerful, folks. God bless you.